Most people already have some knowledge about biology. We have a natural curiosity about animals and other living things. That's why we go to the zoo so often when we're children. So, even though you might not know the specifics about evolution, everyone, if you've ever gone outside, you already know a little bit just from what you've realized already. Let's talk about some of these key insights that have been recognized for hundreds of years that helped lead to the theory of evolution. So, now that we want to talk about these insights about evolution, let's remind ourselves the definition. Evolution explains observations about changes in living organisms. Our goal is to go out and observe what exists and see what connections we can draw based on that. The word evolution has been around for a long time, and it actually predates Darwin by quite a bit. The etymology of the word, so the root where it came from, means unfolding or change over time. The simplest definition of evolution is simply change over time. When you use it, you want to think of a couple things. First, what is changing, and how are you measuring that time? You might remember way back when Obama changed his opinion on gay marriage. At the time, it was said he evolved his opinion. Thank you, Obama, for being on the right side of history, but this is also a really good example of how you can use the word evolution, but not in a biological context. If you're looking at how anything changes over time, that's a great way to use evolution. But you might want to make sure and be clear you're not talking about biological evolution at that point. Here is a really nice quote describing evolution. Animals engage in a struggle for existence, for resources, to avoid being eaten, and to breed. Environmental factors influence organisms to develop new characteristics to ensure survival, thus transforming into new species. Animals that survive to breed can pass on their successful characteristics to offspring. This is a pretty nice quote. And if you didn't know better, most people, when I ask them, assume that this was written by Darwin. However, this is by Al-Jaziz. He is an Afro-Arabian scholar who used to live in what is now Iraq. So a lot of these factors that we acknowledge today as being a part of the theory of evolution have been recognized long before Darwin was ever born. So let's talk about these key observations. First, we notice that species, wherever they live, tend to be well suited to their environment. Next, there's deep similarities between different species. Many species are very similar. We also just have an enormous diversity of living things, and we had to get that diversity somehow. And lastly, we have fossils, which give us an entirely new type of insight. So let's look at these one by one. First, let's look at camels. Camels are, in general, really well suited to living in a desert. Deserts are hot, there's not much water, and really they're just unpleasant places to be. They can actually close their nostrils to protect them from sand getting in. And they have 2 rows of eyelashes to protect their eyes from sand as well. They have fat storage in their hump to help them survive really long periods of time without food or water. Humans are pretty pathetic on that scale. If you don't get water in about 3 days, you're going to die. They also have very long legs to keep their body away from that hot sand. It's really important to be able to dissipate as much heat as possible when you live in a hot environment. They also have really broad pads on their feet so they can avoid sinking into that sand. You might understand this problem if you've ever tried to run on the beach. We can also look at another desert organism. Now let's look at the plants that live here. So in this cactus, it has a really large fleshy stem to store water, but it doesn't have any leaves. It's trying to reduce the amount of surface area so it can reduce the amount of evaporation that occurs because it wants to prevent as much water loss as possible. Also has that thick waxy cuticle, making it even harder for it to lose water via evaporation. It also has these prickly spines because it wants to deter herbivores from eating it. And it also has a large network of roots which we can't see underground to trap as much water as possible. So whenever we're looking at any organism, plant, animal, bacteria, we tend to find really helpful qualities or adaptations that help them survive in that environment which they lived. We also find similar internal structure between different organisms. Here we have a shark, a salamander, and a cat. And we find very similar muscles, even though these guys aren't particularly closely related. We also see the same thing when we look at the bones. So here are the forelimb of a human, a cat, a whale, and a bat. Their overall shape is very different, but you can see they're colored to show the bones which are the same amongst all four of them. So we do have these same bones or homologous bones, just changed in shape and modified for these different purposes. So we have these very deep similarity that can be modified for different ways to move. Next, we just have an enormous diversity of life. There are so many different species that exist out there. We have snakes and monkeys and birds and, tiny little protists and fungi. Like, really, what's going on with fungi? And so many different animals living in different ways. This was noticed especially during the European age of exploration, because now we have people who've been living in one place for all of their life going and looking at a different place and noticing that, oh, everything's different here. The plants are different, the animals are different, and people are noticing through this exchange that there's just different stuff everywhere, and there's even more diversity of life that people had imagined. People are also noticing that we can start to name different species of similar animals. So here we have Asian and African elephants, which are separate species. So you notice that the Asian elephant kind of has this hump on its head. The African elephant is a little bit more sloped here. They also have slightly different morphology of their teeth. This was originally noticed by Cuvier, a French anatomist. And we can also compare the modern day elephants to fossil elephants. You notice they are much more furred because they lived in colder places. As we were noticing all of this diversity of life, we of course had to write it down and catalog it because we are humans with our love of putting things in boxes. So this is the first version of the Systema Naturae, Linnaeus's original publication in 1735 to classify the species he knew at that point. It was so cute. This one is 11 pages long. But of course, he wrote version after version after version. And eventually it became much, much longer. So this is Carl von Linné. It was the fashion at the time to Latinize your name, so that's why we call him Linnaeus, even though that wasn't actually how he was born. Right now, we mostly use the 12th edition that was published between 1766 and 68. You notice it took 2 years to publish. That gives you an idea just how long it was. It was over 300 pages and multiple volumes. And this is where he names order Primates. Today, this is the Naturliche Historie. It's a Dutch publication that's based on Linnaeus's 12th edition, and it's over 8,000 pages. At this point, we're not really putting anything in print anymore because we just have more information coming out all the time, but we have over 1 million species named and described at this point in time. Also in the Systema Naturae, Linnaeus did try to classify humans. So he had Homo sapiens americanus, europaeus, asiaticus, and africanus. So you can see those are related to the different continents. He also had some 2 weird ones, Homo sapiens ferus, or feral children, Homo sapiens monstrosus, people with body modification going on. So he has some problematic ideas here, which really, it's just Homo sapiens. But keep in mind, this is what you might see if you're reading an older version. If you want to look at the Systema Naturae, this is what the taxonomy might look like right now. Here's the taxonomy of the Western tarsier Cephalopithecus bancanus. You might notice for this particular species, there's several subspecies. So there's Bancanus bancanus in southern Sumatra, Bancanus borneanus in Borneo, Bancanus natunensis in Sarassen Island, and Bancanus saltator in Belitung Island. So for some species, we have an additional subspecific definition when people have described an individual population and decided it's distinct enough to get a subspecific name. But let's talk about fossils. Fossils are really cool because now we have evidence of species where they don't currently live now. The first thing we notice is we would find an elephant in a place we wouldn't expect, like Europe or we would find giant deer in a place where giant deer don't exist anymore. So this was giving us evidence of extinction. We're finding species that don't currently live anymore. And this directly challenges essentialism because under the paradigm of essentialism, species can't change. They are immutable. Natural forces can't do anything. But now they're going extinct. So people needed something to explain that with. Here's a quote by Cuvier. Everyone knows that bones of enormous animals are found underground in Siberia, Germany, France, Canada, and even Peru, and that they cannot have belonged to any of the species that live today in those climates. The bones that are found, for example, throughout the north of Europe, Asia, and America, resemble those of elephants so closely in form and then in the texture of the ivory of which their tusks are made that all savants hitherto have taken them to be the same. Other bones have appeared to be those of rhinoceroses, and they are indeed very similar. Yet today there are elephants and rhinoceroses only in the tropical zone of the Old World. How is it that their carcasses are found in such great numbers in the north of both continents? So they hadn't figured out exactly what's going on yet, but this is the beginnings of a crisis, noting that essentialism didn't have all the answers. So, can you explain? What is the simplest definition of evolution, and what are the key insights that led to evolution?